The first chapter of Genesis is not and was never intended to be a scientific explanation of how the world was created, but a revelation and declaration of how great God is. These verses aren't scientific statements, but a story, not a fanciful fairy tale, but foundational truths encapsulated in story form. The carefully crafted creation story takes us where science does not and cannot go, exploring not merely what God has done, but who God is and who we are in relation to him. In the creation story, there are more than 30 references to God. What God did, making, naming, blessing, and his view on creation. God saw that it was good, and they underscore some fundamental truths. First, creation is God's. As its owner, ruler, God appointed his image bearers as representative rulers and trustees of his creation. While free to use and enjoy the earth and its resources, God holds us accountable for our stewardship of this sacred trust. Second, as the designer, developer of human life, God alone knows how life and relationships work best. And so the wise will live according to the Maker's manual. Third, creation is good. Matter is neither evil nor unspiritual, but how we manage the material world, including our own bodies, matters to God. 7 times we hear that creation was good. The 7th time, it was even very good. God can rest peacefully on day 7 with the job well done. And that leads to 2 observations. First, God's rest is the real climax of the story. Humans are very important in chapter 1, and God blesses them and gives them a commission. Though you might notice that the first blessing in the Bible is actually on the first living creatures, fish and birds. There will be many chapters to come where what humans are up to is central. But here, the focus is on what God is doing. And the goal of all creation is to enter into God's rest. Second, the goodness of creation is good news. The first good news. But let's listen carefully. Creation is very good. It is not perfect. Some readers imagine a perfect world in Genesis 1, but this can make it harder to explain how anything ever goes wrong. It's remarkable that the whole creation story is condensed into 31 verses. God created the heavens and the earth. Let dry ground appear. God called the dry ground land, and it was so. The dry ground, the land, is a minimalistic description of the various layers of rocks and soil, containing an abundance and variety of minerals. The creation of light, sun, and moon are also quite brief. As for the stars, in Hebrew they get just 2 words. He also made the stars. Now then, you know that I like looking at Mr. Google. Mr. Google tells me 1 followed by 24 zeros is the number of stars in the observable universe. That's 1 septillion in the American numbering system, or 1 quadrillion in the European system, which is roughly the same as the grains of sand on all the world's seashores. In the creation story, the sand is just lumped under dry ground. And of course, we know that new stars and galaxies are being discovered all the time. So maybe numberless is probably the best answer. Perhaps words are unnecessary. Let creation speak for itself. In Psalm 19, David writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." And by the way, that's another chorus in Haydn's creation. The longest account of creation is given to the creation of humans. David again, this time in Psalm 8. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, what are mere mortals that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them?" Yet he does. In the verses of the creation story, the word God appears 35 times. If we ever get caught up in the creation-evolution debate, to put it in crude terms, and we don't mention God once per sentence, then we have entirely missed the theological emphasis of these verses. In the beginning, God.
The reading comes from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, and it's headed The Tower of Babel. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone, and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over all the face of the earth. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Jennifer. We've skipped 9 chapters of Genesis: Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the families and clans following on from Noah, and so much more. And we arrive at chapter 11, where we read about the Tower of Babel. At that time, the world consisted of one people and one language. Everyone understood each other. They'd reached a plain called Shinar, where Babylon was. The residents decided to build a huge tower reaching up to heaven. God responded by peering down from on high and wondering what this little building project was. He came down to have a look, and he wasn't impressed. The result was that the building project was stopped and people were scattered over all the earth. Does that ring a bell? Wasn't it pretty much what God had in mind for humankind at the time of creation? To scatter and fill the earth? It seems as though it took God's intervention or judgment to get humanity back on track. So through the first 11 chapters, we continue to see examples showing us that God's judgment is for good. There's an interesting link pointed out in the reading guide It's on day 7, so you probably haven't quite got there yet. At the time of the building of the huge Tower of Babel, brick-making was a new technology, but the builders were determined that was the material they wanted to use for their huge structure. They would be able to build higher than ever before. Does that perhaps echo new 21st century technologies, such as artificial intelligence, and how they may alter our lives, either for good or bad? Bigger, smarter, doesn't always mean better. A little bit of background, which doesn't come from the Bible, but from one of my favorite go-to sources for historical accuracy, Josephus. He explains the Tower of Babel in terms of humankind's failings in comparison to God. Humankind is considered to be an inherently flawed creation, dependent on a perfect being for its existence. And thus the construction of the tower is an act of defiance towards the God that created them. And the fact that it was never completed and the workers were scattered only goes to prove God's sovereignty. The place on the plain of Shinar was called Babel. Interestingly, this is a standard Hebrew name for Babylon. Is it too much of a stretch to link ancient Israel's troubles with the later Babylonian Empire? It might have felt that the Babylonians were building towers to the sky and doing as they pleased, but the God of Israel would intervene and get them back on track eventually. Many Bible scholars seem to think that around 2,000 years passed between creation in chapter 1 and this story of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. In Genesis 1, humans had wanted to be like God, and it seems they're still trying to reach heaven, as well as making a name for themselves. When God sees their endeavors, he concludes that nothing will be too hard for them while they're together with a universal language. It's inconceivable that God would really think that nothing was impossible for humans, but he realized that he needed to limit that power. Surely this was related to God's observation that the inclination of human hearts from youth was to evil. We read about it in chapter 8. When you get there, you'll recognize it. When Noah came out of the ark and God promised him, "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood." God's scattering of the people and confusing their language was intended as a safety measure. Ironically, it was the fear of being scattered that had motivated the people to build the city and the tower in the first place. Power is a hugely corrupting influence, and most of us can think immediately of those, other people of course, never place or elsewhere, who seem rather inclined to power. We only have to look at our television screens at this time of electioneering to see people metaphorically clambering over each other to get votes. It's worth asking ourselves what danger we're in regarding power. Parents over children, couples over each other, children over parents, colleagues, teachers, pupils, neighbors. The second part of this chapter, the end of our first block of study, traces the line from Noah's son Shem to Abraham. Again, the genealogy implicitly testifies that God is continuing to bless humans with procreation. Although when we get to Sarai, we have the first account of barrenness in the Bible. Nevertheless, as we know, despite the seeming impossibility of it, God will build a nation for himself from Abraham. It will be another restart. So, a quick summing up of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Creation, with human beings having the capacity to reflect some of God's qualities, such as discovering he is loving, faithful, and forgiving. Although imperfect, we can reflect God's characteristics and ways of working within the created order and through our God-given role as stewards of creation. Chapters 2 to 11 describe the interaction between God and humanity before Abraham. God meeting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then their decision to reject God's plan. Then God's continued interaction with humanity, which deteriorates until God is so grieved he wipes out almost all of his created world in a great flood. But God is resolved to sustain creation. Noah and his family and the creatures God created are given a second chance, together with a covenant that relies on humanity's obedience to and cooperation with God. Although rebellion against God takes hold, there's a thread of hope that God will make a way for his creation to be reconciled back to him. We heard how God intervened. He came down to see the building of the Tower of Babel and acted for the good of humanity. And here's the good news. Since the beginning of time, God has shown unswerving commitment to his good creation, regardless of how often humanity might fail. For God's sovereignty and goodness demands his resilience and saving mercy. The invitation to be his co-workers, therefore, also endures. And that means us. I hope you want to take the challenge of delving into Genesis for the next 4 weeks and take time to discover the how, what, where, and why of creation and our responsibility to continue as God's co-workers in his world.